We
The
can't stop
stagecoach
them.
groaned
We're
to a
beaten.
halt in a
You
cloud
are
of
fighting them
Montana
like
dust.
farmers. You
Its
must
arrival
fight
the
them
biggest
like
event in
Vikings.
Silver Creek that week. On the wooden sidewalk, a small crowd had gathered, their faces etched with curiosity and the harsh lines of a hard life. They were there to see Lars Hansen's new wife. Lars, a gentle giant of a man with calloused hands and a nervous smile, stood at the front, his heart pounding like a drum against his ribs. He had spent months writing letters describing his homestead, his hopes, and his loneliness to a woman in a country he could scarcely imagine. The door of the coach swung open, and she stepped down. A sudden silence fell over the crowd. This was not the woman they had pictured. The mail-order brides they knew were supposed to be timid, perhaps a little worn down by life, eager to blend into the fabric of their new world. The woman standing before them seemed woven from a different cloth entirely. Her name was Astrid. She was tall and straight as a pine tree, with a face that was more striking than pretty, all strong angles and a firm mouth. Her eyes, a pale and piercing winter blue, did not dart away shyly. They moved slowly across the faces of the crowd, taking their measure, and her gaze was so steady and calm it felt to some like a challenge. A thick, wheat-colored braid was coiled neatly at the nape of her neck, and she wore a dress of heavy, practical wool. Unlike any fabric sold in Millie's dress shop, she carried no suitcase, only a single large chest made of dark wood, its sides carved with strange, twisting symbols that told a story no one in Silver Creek could read. Lars stepped forward, his own shyness magnified by her imposing presence. "Miss Astrid?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. She nodded once, a sharp, efficient movement. "Lars Hansen," she said. Her voice was low and carried a strange melody, an accent that clipped the ends of his name, making it sound both familiar and foreign. The journey was long, that was all. There was no tears of joy, no relieved embrace. The women in the crowd exchanged glances. They saw not a grateful bride, but a proud and unapproachable stranger. The children, sensing the adults' disappointment, whispered the word they heard their parents use later that evening. Foreign. They whispered it as she walked with Lars toward his wagon, her back rod straight, her strange chest carried as easily as if it were filled with feathers. She looked not like someone who had come to join them, but like a queen surveying a new and uncertain kingdom. The sun found Astrid early each morning at the Hansen homestead. While the sky was still streaked with pink and orange, she was already outside, her breath making small clouds in the crisp air. She did not wait for Lars to assign her chores. She found them. The axe she swung split logs with a single clean crack, the sound echoing across the quiet yard. She carried water from the pump, 2 heavy buckets at a time without a slosh. She moved with a quiet purpose that was efficient, not hurried. Lars watched her, a quiet amazement growing in him. She was stronger than any farmhand he had ever hired, and she asked for no praise. Yet when the wagon rolled into Silver Creek for supplies, that same capable silence became a wall. Astrid walked beside Lars, her posture erect, her eyes taking in the clapboard stores and the dusty main street with that same unreadable calm. She spoke only when necessary, her requests made in that low musical accent that made ordinary words like flower and nails sound exotic. The children would stop their games to stare, and sometimes a brave one would call out, "Hello, foreign lady," before ducking behind a water trough. Astrid would turn her head, acknowledge them with a slight nod, and continue on, her composure unbroken. This only made the whispers among the adults grow louder. The church social was meant to be a welcome. Tables were laden with pies, roasted meats, and casseroles. The air was warm with laughter and conversation. Astrid arrived with Lars, carrying a cloth-wrapped package. When it was her turn to add to the feast, she unveiled a stack of hard, flat, cracker-like bread. "It is called flatbread," she explained to the woman next to her. A few of the townswomen, led by Millie the seamstress, picked up pieces, sniffed it, and tried to break it with a snap. Their polite smiles quickly faded into poorly concealed sneers. A titter of laughter went through their little group. They called it horse feed and cardboard. They did not try to understand its purpose, to imagine it lasting for months on a long sea voyage or through a harsh winter. They only saw something strange and therefore something less. Astrid said nothing. She did not blush or hang her head. She simply stood there, her hands clasped in front of her wool skirt, her winter blue eyes watching the laughter until it died away, choked by its own meanness. She collected her untouched bread at the end of the afternoon, wrapped it back in its cloth, and walked with Lars to their wagon. She had offered a piece of her home, and it had been rejected. That night, back in the quiet of the farmhouse, she looked at the carved chest sitting at the foot of her bed. She did not open it. She simply laid a hand on its lid, as if drawing strength from the secrets it held, and resolved to keep them locked away for good. The golden days of autumn seemed to flee all at once, as if scared away by a looming threat. It began with a deep, unnatural quiet. The birds stopped their singing and vanished. The air grew so still and heavy it felt like a weight on your chest. Old Tom, who ran the livery stable, squinted at the yellowed sky and spat into the dust. "Ain't right," he muttered to anyone who would listen. "Them clouds ain't friendly. This is going to be a mean one." But even his warning did little to prepare them. The first snow did not flutter down. It attacked. A screaming wind hurled needles of ice against the windows of the homesteads. Within hours, the world outside Astrid's window had vanished, swallowed by a swirling, blinding whiteness that erased the fence lines, buried the barn door, and climbed the walls like a living thing. Day and night blurred into a single howling darkness. Lars and Astrid strung a rope between the house and the barn to keep from getting lost in the 10 steps it took to tend to the animals. The cold was a cruel, biting enemy that seeped through every crack, stealing the warmth from the very stones of the fireplace. Just when they thought the storm itself was the worst of it, a new sound joined the symphony of the wind. It started as a faint high note far away in the shrouded mountains. But each night it grew closer, clearer, and more chilling. It was the howling of wolves, not the lone cry of a single animal, but a chorus of many voices weaving together into a hungry, desperate song. The terrible music would rise and fall with the wind, sometimes sounding miles away and sometimes so close it seemed to be right outside the door. The attack started soon after. Old Man Higgins woke to a scene of bloody carnage in his snow-filled pasture. His prize bull and 2 cows were gone, dragged away with only crimson stains and terrible tracks in the snow to tell the tale. Then it was the Miller family's turn. The wolves surrounded their small cabin, their shadows moving like ghosts in the moonlit snow. They scratched at the door and hurled themselves against the shutters all night long, their snarls and barks keeping the family huddled and terrified until dawn. The wolves were no longer just animals living in the wild. They had become a calculated, organized plague. They were starving, and the isolated farms of Silver Creek were their pantry. The men of the town knew they had to act. They met in the clapboard town hall, their faces grim and etched with fear. They bundled up in their heaviest coats, grabbed their rifles, and ventured out into the deep snow to form hunting parties. But they were farmers and shopkeepers. They knew the price of wheat and the way to mend a fence, but they did not know the ways of a pack of wolves in their own territory in the dead of winter. The men floundered chest-deep in snowdrifts, their progress agonizingly slow. The wolves, sleek and built for this world, watched them from the tree line with glowing eyes before melting back into the white void without a trace. Each time the men returned to town, they were frostbitten, exhausted, and empty-handed. Their fear began to curdle into a helpless despair. They were losing. The wolves were winning, and everyone, from the oldest grandparent to the smallest child, knew deep in their bones that the livestock would not be enough to satisfy the pack for long. The wolves were learning how easy the 2-legged creatures were to hunt. The fear in Silver Creek was no longer a quiet worry. It was a living thing, a cold hand that squeezed the heart of every person in the town. It was a taste like copper in the mouth. The wolves had moved from hunting under the cover of darkness to brazen daytime attacks. They were getting bolder, and the people could feel it. The men's hunting parties had become a sad, dangerous joke. They would return from the frozen wilderness with frostbitten noses and fingers, their spirits lower than when they had left, having seen nothing but unreadable tracks that vanished into nothing. The wolves were phantoms, always one step ahead, understanding the land in a way the farmers never could. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon. The schoolhouse, a small one-room building on the edge of town, was full of children reciting their lessons. The teacher, Miss Palmer, had just called for a spelling bee when the first shadow passed by a window. Then another. A low guttural growl vibrated through the wooden walls. Suddenly, a gaunt gray shape hurled itself against the door with a solid, terrifying thud. The children screamed. More wolves appeared, their eyes glowing with a hungry intelligence as they circled the building, scratching at the door, jumping at the windows, their barking and snarling a horrifying cacophony that drowned out the children's cries. Miss Palmer, her face white as the snow outside, barricaded the door with a desk and gathered the terrified children into the farthest corner. For what felt like an eternity they were trapped, listening to the pack trying to find a way in. It was only the frantic ringing of the church bell that saved them. Men came running from the town with rifles and burning torches, their shouts and the fire's light finally scaring the wolves away into the trees. The siege was over, but the damage was done. The children were hysterical. The parents were shaken to their very core. The wolves had moved from the fields to their very doorstep. They had threatened their most precious treasures, their children. That evening, the town hall was packed. The air was thick with smoke and a panicked energy. The men were no longer just frustrated. They were defeated. Their arguments went in circles. Track them? They had tried. Postcards? They did not have enough men or bullets. Wait them out? The winter was endless and the wolves were not leaving. Lars Hansen sat in the corner, his head in his hands. He thought of Astrid alone at the homestead and a cold dread seized him. He stood up and without a word, left the meeting. He had to get home. When he pushed open his heavy door, shaking the snow from his coat, he found Astrid sitting perfectly still by the fire, mending a harness. Her calmness in the face of the terror outside felt almost strange. "It is no use, Astrid," Lars said, his voice hollow with exhaustion and fear. "The wolves. They surrounded the schoolhouse today. The children. We cannot stop them. We are just waiting our turn to be hunted. We are beaten." Astrid set down her mending. She looked from Lars's despairing face to the dark window, where the wind still howled its timeless song. But now another song answered it. The high, lonely cry of the wolf pack rang out, much closer than before. A strange light came into Astrid's winter blue eyes. It was not fear. It was a deep, ancient recognition. She had heard this song before in the old stories told by her grandfather beside a great fire in a land of fjords and forests. "They are not just animals," she said, her voice low and steady, cutting through the panic that Lars had brought in with him. "You are fighting them like farmers. You are fighting for your property." She stood up, her tall frame straight and sure. "You must stop fighting for your barns and start fighting for your home. You must fight them like Vikings." The silence in the Hansen farmhouse was heavy, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant, haunting cry of the wolves. Lars stared at Astrid, her words hanging in the air. Fight them like Vikings. He did not know what that meant, but the look in her eyes was one of such fierce certainty that he found himself nodding, his own despair momentarily held at bay. Without another word, Astrid turned and walked to the large carved chest at the foot of their bed. She had not opened it since the day she arrived. Now she produced a small iron key from a chain around her neck and turned it in the lock. The click echoed in the quiet room. She lifted the lid. Inside were not the linens or keepsakes of a typical bride. These were the treasures of a different life. First, she lifted out a magnificent pelt of a great white wolf, its fur thick and shimmering in the firelight. Next came a helmet, not the horned kind of silly stories, but a real one. It was made of aged blackened iron with a strong nose guard, and it was etched with strange angular symbols that seemed to tell a story of their own. Lastly, she drew out a long, single-edged blade. It was a seax, a Viking fighting knife. The steel of the blade, though old, had been cared for with a warrior's respect. It gleamed with a deadly sharp light. She dressed slowly and deliberately, the wolf pelt draping over her shoulders like a cloak of authority, the iron helmet settling onto her brow. She looked transformed. No longer a farmer's wife, but a figure from a legend. A Shieldmaiden stepped out of the ancient sagas. She walked into town. The few people braving the cold to rush between houses stopped dead in their tracks. Their mouths fell open. Some crossed themselves, believing they were seeing a ghost or a winter spirit. She paid them no mind. Her gaze was fixed ahead. She pushed open the doors of the town hall where the men were still arguing in helpless circles. The room fell into a stunned, disbelieving silence. All eyes turned to her. The sheriff, his face red with frustration and fear, was the first to find his voice. "Woman, have you lost your mind?" "What is this nonsense?" Astrid's voice did not rise to meet his anger. It was calm, cold, and sharp as the blade in her hand. "Your way has failed. The wolves are at the schoolhouse. Your children are not safe. You will listen to me now." She swept her gaze across the room, meeting the eyes of each defeated man. "You are farmers. You think like farmers. You hunt for meat and hide. These wolves are not for hunting. They are an army and they have a general. We will find their leader. We will break his spirit, and his army will run." The sheriff began to protest again, but a rancher named Joe, whose youngest daughter had been in the schoolhouse, stood up. The men with guns have done nothing but freeze. I will listen to the woman with a plan. One by one, the other men, shamed by their failure and desperate for any hope, nodded their agreement. Astrid took command. She gave them new orders. They were not to gather bullets, but to gather every pot and kettle they could find. They were to collect tar and pitch from the lumber yard. They were to build braziers, great iron pots that could hold fire. They were to get lanterns and torches. They were to prepare for a battle of light and noise, not of bullets. For the first time in weeks, the men of Silver Creek had a purpose. They had a leader, and they moved with a speed and determination they had long forgotten. The night was bitterly cold, the kind of cold that stole your breath and made the stars overhead look like chips of sharp, frozen glass. The full moon cast a pale blue light over the deep snow, turning the world into a ghostly landscape of black and white. From the edge of the forest, the wolf pack's howls echoed, a sound that had become the town's nightly terror. But tonight Silver Creek was not hiding. Under Astrid's command, the entire town had become an army. Men and older boys carried iron braziers filled with burning tar, their flames casting long, dancing shadows. Others held rifles not to shoot but to make noise. They followed Astrid, a silent, grim procession moving through the snow toward the box canyon west of town. Astrid's plan was one of cunning, not brute force. Using the gunshots and shouts of the men, they began to herd the wolves. They did not chase them. Instead, they created a moving wall of sound and fire, funneling the confused and snarling animals into the narrow mouth of the canyon. The wolves, their night eyes blinded by the sudden flames, their keen hearing assaulted by the terrible noise, milled together in a growing panic. They were trapped. At the canyon's entrance, the men quickly lit a semicircle of the tar-filled braziers, creating a roaring, crackling wall of fire that sealed the pack inside. The canyon walls were too steep to climb. The wolves were caged. Then, he emerged from the center of the pack. The alpha wolf. He was a monster of muscle and fur, larger than any wolf any of them had ever seen, with a scar across his muzzle and eyes that burned with a savage, ancient hatred. He snarled at the flames at the men, refusing to be cowed. This was the moment. Astrid stepped forward. She walked calmly through a gap in the ring of fire, entering the canyon alone. The men gasped. She raised her sayax and began to pound the hilt against her iron helmet. Clang, clang, clang. The harsh metallic noise was alien and terrifying in the natural night. Then she let out a cry. It was not a scream of fear, but a fierce, ululating battle chant, a sound that was older than the mountains around them. The alpha wolf, enraged by the challenge, by the fire, by the horrible noise, charged. He was a blur of gray fury, leaping through the snow straight for her throat. The men held their breath, their rifles useless. But Astrid did not flinch. At the very last second, she moved with a speed that belied her size, sidestepping the lunging beast. As it flew past her, she did not use the sharp edge of her blade. She turned it and brought the flat of the sayax down upon the wolf's skull with a crack that echoed off the stone walls. It was not a killing blow. It was a blow of dominance. The great wolf stumbled, dazed and whining, shaking its head. Astrid stood over it, the point of her blade at its throat. She let out another shorter, commanding cry. The beast lay still, yielding. She then pointed her sayax away from the town, toward the deep, dark wilderness of the high mountains. She shouted a single guttural word in Norwegian, a word of expulsion. The alpha wolf scrambled to its feet. With its tail tucked between its legs, it turned and fled, running past its own pack and up the canyon trail. The rest of the wolves, their spirit broken with their leader's defeat, flowed after him like a gray river, vanishing into the shadows from whence they came. The canyon was empty. The battle was over. And Astrid had won without shedding a single drop of blood. The unnatural silence that followed the wolves' retreat was louder than any howl. For a long moment, the men of Silver Creek simply stood, their torches and rifles hanging limp at their sides, their faces masks of stunned disbelief. They had witnessed something that defied all their understanding of the world. They had seen a legend walk out of a storybook and into their lives. Then, as one, they turned to look at the woman standing alone in the center of the conquered canyon. Astrid turned and walked back through the ring of fire, the flames reflected in the cold iron of her helmet and the pale blue of her eyes. She was no longer a mysterious foreigner or a farmer's mail-order bride. She was the woman who had faced the night itself and commanded it to leave. The sheriff, a proud and stubborn man, was the first to move. He slowly removed his hat, clutching it over his heart. One by one, every other man followed his lead, a silent, powerful gesture of respect that spoke more than any speech could. The next morning, the blizzards finally broke. A weak but determined sun broke through the clouds, glinting off a world encased in diamond-white ice. It felt like the first morning of a new world. The terrible waiting fear was gone. Later that day, a knock came at the Hansens' farmhouse door. Astrid opened it to find Millie the seamstress standing there, not with a critical eye or gossip on her lips, but with a perfectly baked apple pie, its crust golden brown, held carefully in her mittened hands. "I made this for you," Millie said, her voice softer than Astrid had ever heard it. "For all of us, we are in your debt, Astrid. We were wrong. So very wrong." Astrid accepted the pie with a small, gracious nod. It was not a wide smile, but it was an acceptance, a bridge built between two worlds. The children no longer whispered "foreigner" when she came to town. Now they looked at her with wide, awestruck eyes. They asked her to tell stories of the fjords and the Vikings, and sometimes she would tell them a small one, about longships and northern stars. Astrid's carved chest now sat at the foot of her bed, its lid often left unlocked. The helmet and the sayax and the wolf pelt were inside, but they were no longer secrets to be hidden. They were a part of her history, a history that had saved her future. She was no longer the foreign bride. She was Astrid of Silver Creek. She was their protector, their neighbor, and finally their friend. She had come to this new land looking for a home, and in the end, she had not just found one. She had earned it. The end.